Good evening. The big news today that's been announced is that Turkey has agreed to drop its veto, and that will allow Sweden to enter NATO. Now, it's not quite that simple. While President Erdogan has indicated that he will now rescind the veto and will look to support Sweden joining NATO, he first of all has to take that to the government of Ankara and get that approved there. So this isn't a done deal just yet. And also, there is still the remaining question of Hungary. Now, at this stage, Hungary have not come out and confirmed if they will also rescind their veto position on Sweden joining NATO. Up until recently, both Turkey and Hungary have indicated they would not allow Sweden into the NATO alliance, with Turkey now changing their position there. This leaves Hungary in an interesting spot. While I've spoken about Turkey and Erdogan being in the kingmaker position of late, because they hold this power between Russia and NATO, Hungary now is in a position where they could either find themselves under massive Western pressure and backroom deals being done to force them to allow Sweden in, or if they play their cards correctly, they may be able to use this as a large lever to gain some concessions, gain some wins from the West and other NATO states. It's yet to be seen. I think the general consensus is that Hungary will follow Turkey's lead and will admit Sweden to NATO. They have in the past commented that if Turkey does, that they will. However, after the announcement today by Erdogan that he would now support Sweden joining NATO, there hasn't been a subsequent release that I've seen from Hungary indicating the same. Now, this will make the NATO Summit, which is starting, tomorrow in Vilnius, interesting. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has come out saying that he believes that all NATO states, or almost all NATO states, are in support of Ukraine joining NATO, and that they are a de facto member of NATO, and that at this summit that this should be confirmed. Whether this happens for him or not is to be seen. The US President Biden has stated that he doesn't believe that Ukraine are ready to be admitted to NATO, and that could only happen at the end of the war with Russia. Now, that raises interesting questions. If, for example, the hostilities get to a point where they could, perhaps negotiations could be started and the fighting itself may stop, while Ukraine may wish to claim that this is the end of the war. They may be in a position now where Russia could claim that they haven't ceased their special military operation, and this might be something that would then halt halt Ukraine ascension to NATO. Part of the reason why the Western nations like the United States may be hesitant to admitting Ukraine to NATO is because they will see, or they believe that Russia and President Putin in Russia will see that as an escalation, and that it's likely to then lead to a major conflict between NATO and Russia. Now, what we've got now is a proxy situation where NATO material, NATO trainers, NATO equipment, NATO ammunition and weapons are given to Ukraine, but Ukrainians are doing the fighting. Now, this is something that the US has been able to garner support for. They've supplied $1 billion of aid or thereabouts. And while there aren't American forces on the ground fighting, that's something that the US Congress can keep at arm's reach and can probably get through successfully and continue to fund Ukraine. And this is probably similar for many of the NATO nations who are currently giving aid to Ukraine. They're able to claim that they're doing this for the better good of the NATO states and to support Ukraine. However, if Ukraine is admitted to NATO and then Russian attacks on Ukraine trigger a NATO Article 5 situation, which is a situation where if a NATO state is attacked, all other NATO states are compelled to then support them, including military support, then we would end up in a position where we could have British, German, American, Polish troops on the ground in Ukraine. Now, politically, that becomes a very different sausage to sell when you start having the 6 o'clock news showing footage of coffins returning to London and Washington draped in the country's flags, and when the taxpayers of the UK and Germany and the United States who are funding the aid to Ukraine suddenly start seeing their boys coming home in coffins. Politically, this becomes a challenge for those nations. So I think this may be part of the reason why Biden has said he doesn't believe that Ukraine is ready. If Biden were to say today Ukraine should be admitted, then I'm sure this weekend they would find a way and that would happen. But then the logical next step is that the Article 5 situation would occur and we would rapidly find US, British, Polish, German, and all the NATO states putting their boots on the ground. And again, in many of these nations where they are starting to already receive political pushback from their constituents because of the amount of funding that has been sent to Ukraine, and given the way that the big Ukrainian offensive has bogged down, they're not seeing a return on their investment. They can't claim that it was all worthwhile because Russia was defeated and democracy has won. Instead, the problem seems to be deepening for the West, where they are seeing at home growing lack of support for continuing to send taxpayer money over to Ukraine. So this is why I think Biden is sort of saying no at this stage. Obviously, Zelensky is looking for something different. The outcome of the Vilnius Summit will be interesting, as Zelensky may leave it very disappointed. He may end up leaving the summit with no change in the situation, without Ukraine being admitted to NATO, without there being any clear roadmap for that given to him, other than the statements that have currently been given that after the completion of the war that could occur. He may not even get security guarantees by some of the Eastern European states. As the former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen was suggesting, in the last couple of months, he's been trying to drum up support for perhaps Poland or Romania and some of those closer states to give their own security guarantees to Ukraine. This in itself is problematic for NATO, as if they start to find fracturing within the group, if they find a country, let's say like like Poland, who offers a security guarantee, then if Poland finds that it is then attacked by Russia, because they are considered to be now a full part of the war, then the rest of the NATO nations could be dragged into the conflict, which, given the Western reporting recently on the problems the West is having with providing Ukraine with ammunition. We've seen Biden this week approve the supply of 155mm cluster munitions. Now, these cluster munitions are being provided because, in Biden's own words and in other Biden officials' statements, this is being done to fill a gap, to allow Ukraine to continue to receive ammunition of the 155mm variety so that they can fire something. Now, what they're receiving, these cluster munitions, serve a certain purpose, but are certainly not the type of shells that they will want for a lot of their activity. These aren't high explosive or armor-piercing rounds. These are rounds that fire or clusters of smaller munitions. These munitions are very useful for deploying onto troops of soldiers, especially if they're out in the open, something like that. If you can land these on their trenches, they'd be useful in those areas, that situation, I suppose. But they're not the sort of thing that you can use against a tank, a T-90 tank or a T-72 tank. These will do nothing to those. Russian armoured personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles won't be deterred by these, so the application for them is limited. So we've got that example. We've got, while we're still seeing support coming from the West, we're not seeing the sort of equipment that Ukraine is after. We're not seeing Leopard 2s being provided anymore. An initial tranche has been given. Many of those have been destroyed already. Germany is providing Leopard 1s, but as I discussed yesterday, the Leopard 1s have a much smaller 105mm gun on them, not the 155mm, so they're dramatically underpowered in a artillery battle against the Russian artillery or Russian tanks. There's still talk about F-16s, which I'll come back to those in a moment because they play into what's just happened with Turkey. But there's talk about F-16s being supplied, but even those being supplied to Ukraine, there is a thought in the West that they will be less than effective given the superior Russian air defense. There has been some commentary made by previous F-16 pilots that they feel that any F-16s in Ukraine at this stage would be relegated to rear area support, perhaps patrolling around Kiev and providing some air defense capabilities there for incoming missiles, but that they would not last if they were taken near the front line due to the overwhelming power of the Russian air defense capability, which seems to be in existence. Again, yesterday there was reporting of another Ukrainian jet being shot down. Just from memory, within about the last 7 days, I think that's the fifth one that I've heard of being shot down. There may have been more. So the Western NATO nations, for a number of reasons, I think don't really want to get into a full-blown stoush with Russia. As reported by Alexander Mercouris on the Duran yesterday, the Ukrainians are firing around 5,000 shells per day. The Russians are firing 8 times that many, up to 40,000 a day. Now, the Russians have indicated they have a massive stockpile of shells still, somewhere in the range of perhaps 9 million shells. So they don't seem to be running out. We've heard reports that their production of shells has increased multiple times over the course of the war, and that they do not see an issue with operating as needed through this conflict. Now, 40,000 shells a day, I don't think the Russians can sustain that forever, but they can certainly apply that pressure to the Ukrainians while the Ukrainians are suffering shell shortages to obtain an advantage. So, you know, if you were to think of the US or Britain, so Britain, if they were to get into this, Britain's army has become underfunded over the last 20 years. It's decreased dramatically from the size that it was. Reporting is that Britain has very few operational tanks. They may have, I think, 100 Typhoon fighters, and I think a large number of those Typhoons may not be actual battle ready. So even if they were to come into the conflict full force with everything they have at once, they don't have large supply capability behind them. They, on the ground, would encounter the same challenges that the Ukrainians have been. The NATO nations would need to put a large effort into providing some sort of air superiority for even F-16s to have some real impact on the battlefield. So this might lead to having to deploy F-22s or F-35s, that sort of cutting edge US technology into the fight. And again, for perhaps the first time, they would then be challenged in a real world scenario up against Russia's best air defense systems, which they have probably had very little experience with in the past, and certainly not in a position in the past where they were coming from a place of not initially having the overwhelming air superiority. So I think there are a number of reasons why NATO would prefer not to get into this conflict entirely at this stage. There's always the risk, of course, that some false flag attack could be used to draw them in. We've had many reports about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. How I think the general consensus has been that if anything was going to be launched in an attack against the Zaporozhye plant, it would more likely have been the Ukrainians doing this to try and bring NATO support to them. We had the recent, up until this week, denials of the original bombing of the Kerch Bridge by the Ukrainians, which has now been admitted to. So there certainly would be an opportunity if Ukraine and Zelensky wished to draw NATO into this, would be to stage an attack, make it look like the Russians, and fire some missiles into Poland or Romania. If they were then able to convince those countries that it was Russia that had attacked, then those countries would have to make a very tough call. Do they want to get into the fight with Russia? If again, Russia has been talking about their silent mobilization. So they did a major mobilization in September of last year, and they raised 150,000 reservists. I believe the bulk of those people were reservists who had previous military training. Now there have been reports from Shoigu that they are seeing upwards of 10,000 volunteers a week signing up to join the Russian army. When Putin a couple of weeks ago had an interview with a number of war reporters, he was asked then, are they going to do a mobilization? And I think his response at the time was, in the future, if they need to, they will, but right now they don't feel they need to. Now, if they're getting 10 or 12,000 volunteers a week, then they've got that silent mobilization going on. Now, also, if push came to shove, and Russia really took on a complete war footing, they have a population of 140 million people. They have the ability to be able to draw upon that and field large numbers of troops. As I was saying before, by all accounts, they've got a head start on the NATO nations in terms of the ammunition and shell production, and quite possibly missile production. In a Western report from one of the think tanks I was reading this week, they were indicating where they had been doing some war games and planning for what might happen if the US was to go to war with China, or actually if China was to initiate a military take of control seizure of Taiwan, and if the US was then required to act upon that. And the findings were that in the war games, nearly all of the times, China won, which makes sense given that China is so close, they have less distance to travel. But the US, in their studies, they were found that the critical element to help them be successful would be submarines. The report indicated they didn't believe that America had enough submarines, and that of those submarines that they do have, that a number of them are out of action under long-term maintenance schedules. And then finally, the report indicated that they believed that there would be a shortage of long-range missiles that the US would need to be able to defeat China in a dispute over Taiwan. So, and remember, these reports are not coming out of Russia. These reports are coming out of US think tanks. Biden himself is saying the Ukrainians are low on ammunition. Now, given that the US is a major provider of ammunition to Ukraine, you may then sort of by default assume that he's saying that they are low on ammunition. So, yeah, these are real challenges that I think would make the NATO nations think about getting into a dispute, a real proper boots on the ground dispute. Even if they do, again, they're going to be encountering the same sort of defences that the Ukrainian forces have. Now, the Ukrainian forces were, at the start of the offensive in June, some of those brigades that suffered tremendous losses of tanks and heavy equipment in those minefields in the first 3 days of the offensive were allegedly NATO-trained troops, so using NATO doctrines, trained on NATO equipment, and they didn't fare well. Now, while there has been, up until perhaps the last 2 days, a change in tactics, the Ukrainians certainly realised that they were not being successful with the armoured column advances through minefields. They had moved to what's been talked about now as the mosquito attacks, which is where they would send small groups of light infantry men with machine guns to attack Russian positions, drive them up quickly in an armoured personnel carrier, let them out, let them run forward, suffer heavy losses, send up another troop, and eventually, after suffering many heavy losses, push the Russians out of that defensive position that they were in. Now, while that has perhaps had some success, it's been very limited. The ground made by the Ukrainians in the last 5 weeks has been very small, and most of the ground that has been taken has been small villages and hamlets. There hasn't been any major cities taken or any major advances or land taken back off the Russians. There is some reporting that the Russians have even claimed some more land in the last week. So while they at the start of this offensive, they did recognise after those first 3 days the heavy column advances weren't working. In the last 2 days, around Robitno, there seems to have been a resumption of that tactic, and in some of the video footage I've seen in the last 48 hours, there have again been devastating losses. I reported that Ukraine's commander Zelensky had been reporting to Zelensky that they were losing in the south between 5 and 7 pieces of heavy equipment a day, and I think it was 4 in the east. In some of the footage that I've seen today, I believe in one case there were 10 pieces of equipment lost in one area, and there was some other footage showing some other heavy losses. So, if this is continuing, if these numbers are going to be lost of the Western supplied tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, mine clearing tanks, and that sort of thing, at the rates of 10 or more a day, then that can't be sustained for very long. And if the US do come, if the Polish do come, then they are going to be suffering similar challenges. And we've got to remember that at the moment, the Ukrainians are suffering these losses in the grey zone, in the disputed territory between the real front lines. At no point through this offensive have the Ukrainians made it to the really strong, established Russian defensive lines. So even if the NATO boots on the ground do arrive, they still have to get to where the Ukrainians are now. They still have to push beyond that and get through the deeper defences. And it's not something that would happen overnight. You know, it takes time to mobilize an army and to get them moving. The Russians will no doubt be watching that very closely. And I'm sure that they will be preparing so that if something like that were to happen, that they would be, they would be ready for that. I think a lot of people perhaps think that because Russia started this special military operation in February of 2022 with a relatively small force and didn't appear to perhaps achieve what some in the West said they thought the Russian goals were, that maybe Russia wasn't prepared and wasn't ready for this. I don't think that's the case. I think that Russia has been probably preparing for this since 2008 and certainly since 2014. For a long time, they've been ready and aware of what was coming this way. They've known that NATO expansion is coming. So for the Russians, I would imagine that they are prepared for it to continue and for things to escalate. And while I'm sure they would prefer it not to go that way, I think it would be foolish to assume that if NATO did make the decision to join, that there would suddenly be an overwhelming sweep by NATO and Russia would be just wiped off the table. That I don't think would occur at all. So the next couple of days will be very interesting as the NATO summit happens. Now, Erdogan, very interesting. He's been popping up a lot in the news just of late, obviously with the release of the Azov commanders back to the Ukraine, and I've had some very well thought out and interesting comments on some of my videos about that. Their 180 or U-turn, Erdogan's 180 or U-turn on Sweden has not been done out of the goodness of his heart. Obviously, there has been some deal done which has been beneficial to Turkey and acceptable by Erdogan. Now, what that is exactly, I don't know, and I don't think we know yet, but we can certainly speculate about that based on some of the reporting that's been around in the last day or so. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in Erdogan's discussions with Biden just recently, two topics there actually. One was the discussion around F-16s, and the other about Turkey's ascension into the EU, the European Union. Now, it's interesting that President Erdogan was having discussions about EU entry with the American president, who is not a part of the EU. Yet that's where publicly Erdogan was having these discussions. So it seems like perhaps there has been a deal done where Turkey may receive some F-16s as part of this deal for them to agree to let Sweden join NATO, and possibly that the US will support Turkey in their plans to recommence a process of seeing Turkey join the EU. Now, there was a whole suite of photographs today with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, with Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and President Erdogan shaking hands. There was a comment from Erdogan where this is actually from earlier in the week, just before the announcements today, but he said, "First come and open the way for Turkey in the EU. After that, we'll open the way for Sweden, just like we did for Finland." So he mentioned this at a conference in Istanbul before leaving for NATO's summit. And he criticised countries keeping Turkey waiting at the EU's door for almost 50 years. So perhaps something in the background has been done. And we will see, we'll find out if things do move and Turkey looks like joining the EU. That itself is going to obviously be another big challenge, because there will be states within the EU who do not want Turkey in there. But as we can see, leaders and countries can change their mind on these things. You know, the F-16s. A little while ago, I mentioned that Turkey straddles a fine line with the West and Russia. It's neighbouring Russia. It sees a lot of transport go through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus from Russia, which it charges tonnage on. It's just put its tonnage rates up. So as freight flows through from Russia, Turkey, captures quite a bit of revenue there. Now, Turkey has purchased an S-400 air defense system from Russia, and reportedly, when that became known to the West, the US, there were sales being discussed for F-35s, I think it was, F-22s, perhaps F-35s, to Turkey, and that deal was cancelled then at that stage. So now perhaps this deal with letting Sweden in is opening up the doors to Turkey getting access to some of the US jets again. F-16s have been mentioned there. At a press briefing from a State Department spokesman, Matthew Miller, who was in Washington speaking today, he was saying that the US has supported the provision of F-16s to Turkey and have done so for some time. He did say something interesting here, that we've made that clear publicly that we support it, but there are a number of members of Congress who, as much as we don't believe the issue should be linked with NATO accession, there are members of Congress who believe that it is. So we always make that clear privately and publicly. So what he's saying here is that, well, I think effectively reading between the lines, he's indicating that the F-16 deal is part of what got Erdogan to say yes to Sweden, and that there are members of Congress who are aware of that and not particularly happy with it, but that it's happened, it's gone ahead anyhow. So we'll see, I suppose, in the future to see if that does happen. A last comment from Miller, which was on Turkey's EU bid. He said that the United States has, for a number of years, supported Turkey's EU aspirations, and we continue to do so. So, positive words from the US on that topic, which is what Erdogan would have been after. Look at just a little bit of information still to do with Turkey. There was some footage today of a series of explosions in, I think, in northern Syria, and some casualties. Now, these casualties were, I believe, Turkish aligned Syrian groups fighting against Assad. It's unclear who launched the attack there, but there have been reports that the Russian Air Force have been supporting Assad against these Turkish-backed groups. So these type of things will be an irritant to Erdogan, and perhaps influencing him in his decision to release the Azov fighters, and to let Sweden in. I'll just touch a little bit on, just to finish off, just a little bit on those Azov commanders being released again. So the little bit of the background there. So when the fighting was happening last year at the Azov Steelworks, this big industrial factory, which became effectively a fortress for the Azov fighters. Once that fighting got to the point where the Russians had effectively surrounded the area, and they were able to take a number of prisoners, then a prisoner swap deal was done. And given the nature, the history, the ideology of the Azov Brigade, which is not appreciated in Russia, let's say, the deal was such that in the prisoner swap for the Azov commanders who had survived, that they wouldn't be allowed to go back to Ukraine to rejoin the fighting, and instead they would be taken and held in Turkey. Now, obviously Russia has a history with right-wing extremist groups, which they believe the Azov fighters to be, and which they clearly was one of the reasons that they didn't want them sort of just back in Ukraine returning to the fight. Now, the deal done to allow those Azov commanders to go back to Ukraine, personally, my opinion is I don't believe that this would have actually been a surprise to Putin. I don't think that Erdogan would have done this without informing Putin. My thoughts are that in terms of the impact that this will have on the battlefield, it will be negligible. If those commanders go back and do get back into the fight, they'll be going up into the same harsh conditions that the rest of the Ukrainians are in, and there will be bounties on their heads. The Russians will be looking for them specifically. So I don't think that it's going to have a great military impact, them returning to the fight. From the media and PR perspective, definitely a big win for Zelensky just before the NATO summit to be able to say, look, I've been able to engineer a deal and get my commanders of the Azov regiment back. So publicity, yeah, there's definitely a plus there. But in terms of actual downside for Putin, not a great deal. It's not like he's going to have to contend with Russians being killed now because of this activity, or a major loss on the battlefront. Yes, it's a bit of a pain. You know, it's not what he would have wanted. Someone will probably be saying, "Oh, look, you look weak. Turkey has done this without contacting you or getting your approval." Minor, I think, perhaps in the scheme of things. Pardon me, but Putin, I think, is a shrewd politician and is able to find the silver lining in these situations. Because now he does have, I believe, a card up his sleeve which he can play with Erdogan. When he wants to, he can say, "You did this deal, you know, we were okay with it, allowed it to happen, but you owe us one." You know, like, I can understand, Erdogan, why you want to do this. You're getting lots of pressure from the West at the moment. The NATO summit's coming up. Zelensky's giving you a heap of grief. Sure, let them go, but you owe us one. And as I commented yesterday, that this might be used, Putin might use this card as a way of explaining why he won't extend the grain deal. The grain deal, it's a point of contention for Turkey. Turkey wants to keep it going. Erdogan was involved in getting that grain deal happening. If it falls apart, it doesn't look great on him. As I mentioned, if the grain deal shuts down and the Russian Black Fleet blockade those ports in Odessa, then there's a restriction of trade flowing through there. There's less revenue coming in for Turkey. So for those reasons, yeah, I think that Turkey is in a position where Putin could have seen, yep, I can see why, I'll let you do this. But I think that Erdogan will effectively owe Putin one. And when it comes time to saying we're not doing the grain deal, Putin can just turn around now and say, look, Turkey reneged on their deal. We can't trust them. And that's why we are not extending this deal. Anyhow, that's enough for tonight. The next couple of days should be really interesting as we start to hear what is going to happen at the NATO summit. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you very much if you've watched, listened to here. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Deep 404. I'm also just setting up on Rumble and Locals, so if you prefer to watch content there, that'll be coming up there very soon. Yeah, give us a like, pass on to your friends. Have a good day.